Next objection. Leo, how can science be relative? Doesn't science deliver us the truth? It sure seems that way. Science is very deceptive in that we use it to create all this fancy technology, and then we think like, well, it must be true, and therefore nothing more needs to be said about it. No, that's not at all the case. Science is relative in many ways. I've already talked about how science is relative to the era that it's being done in. Very much so. The science that will happen in 1,000 years will be so radically different from today's science that we will look back and look at today's science, 21st century science, as the equivalent of doctors bleeding their patients with leeches or some other form of quackery. That's how modern physics will look in 1,000 years. Science is also relative in that it's a very specific epistemic system with various standards, premises, methods, and techniques that it uses. And the very notion of what counts as science is fluid. Science itself changes. By doing more science, you change how you understand what science is, because science, most generally speaking, is simply the investigation of reality. And as you investigate reality, of course, science itself is what? A part of reality. So as you're investigating reality, you're also investigating science, and you're learning how to do science better. And actually, the boundaries of what qualifies as science will change, such that, for example, in 1,000 years, many spiritual techniques, meditative and yogic techniques that today are not counted as science, will be admitted and accepted as legitimate science. So what counts as legitimate science, this very much depends on how we think of science culturally and bureaucratically in our institutions. And you better believe that's going to change. And in fact, science in the next 1,000 years will change more than science did in the first 1,000 years, the last 1,000 years. There's many changes and reforms that are needed to science. And then, of course, science is actually literally done differently. People assume that, well, science is just universal. Science is not universal. Science is how humans understand the world. If there are aliens out there, one day we meet them, they will have a different version of science than what we have. Radically different, perhaps. In some ways it might be similar, but also radically different. There's even differences between the way men and women do science. Next objection. Leo, but how come scientists agree on the same factual data if you're saying that physics and the actual physical substrate of reality is relative? This is a very good question. First of all, I want you to notice that a lot of scientists do not agree on the data. There's a lot of debate about this, and what science is about is gathering consensus. And a lot of what that is about convincing others of your way of looking at the world. And how you look at the world, of course, affects the kind of data that you see. And a lot of times, one scientist looks at the world this way, gets one kind of data. Another scientist looks at the world using a different set of paradigms and premises, gets a different set of data. And this data, in a sense, is incommensurable. It can't be directly correlated and compared. Now, of course, in very simple cases, scientists do often agree on the data. You know, you can get a ruler, give it to one scientist, give a ruler to another scientist. They can measure an elephant from nose to tail and discover, some common number. Although even that is not always as easy as it seems. So, because rulers are different, measuring instruments are different. It's hard to calibrate them. But let's say they do come up with the same data. You have to understand that there's different levels and layers to relativity. So, for example, the data scientists agree upon is highly contingent upon which states of consciousness both of these scientists are in, and also the fact that they're both humans. and they share a similar educational background, similar culture. They work for similar types of institutions. They both grew up in the same era, of course. They have the same similar brains, similar neurology, similar perceptual systems, virtually identical DNA. So all of that is necessary for scientists to be able to agree on data. Try getting two scientists who have even a 1% difference in their DNA to both agree on the same data. That would be very difficult to do. So, see, part of the problem is because really humans are like the only intelligent species that we know of on this planet and in this physical universe. And so the problem becomes is that we're so isolated that we tend to think that we're so good and so smart. And this lets us get away with not acknowledging the relativity of our own deepest held assumptions and worldviews. Because even though we do have lots of different cultures around the planet, still most of the humans who have all these different cultures still have 99% the same DNA, very similar brains, very similar perceptual organs and neurology. And so therefore, of course, we all tend to think alike and we all tend to agree. But, try getting a scientist to agree with some alien scientist from another planet. That would be very, very different. And you could imagine that they would disagree about what the data really is. Also, the notion of data or facts is itself a relative notion, you see, because it's completely contingent upon which state of consciousness you're in. Different states of consciousness produce different data. So when you're dreaming and sleeping, that's one set of data. When you're awake here in the world, that's another set of data, and so on. So, yeah, just because like we can both look at a physical object and agree that that's a tree or a cat or something like that, we have the same raw physical data. Understand that's deeply entangled with our entire nervous system. But also, I want to address an even deeper point here, which is a point about the absolute. So here, and we're going to also address an additional objection to relativism. A lot of people have a sort of just intuitive, almost knee-jerk reaction against relativism, especially a lot of scientifically minded people, because they tend to just intuit that there must be something about reality which is not subjective, which is an absolute. And it's that which they want to call the data or the facts. And in a certain sense, this intuition is actually correct. Because there is the absolute. There is being. And in fact, the only thing there is the absolute. The only thing there is being. And so being is literally the very substrate of everything. But this being that I'm talking about here, this is not the same thing as what you mean when you, as a scientist or as a normal person, have your facts and your data. That is not being. That is a conceptual projection that you're adding on to being. So, in a sense, what I'm saying here is that if you are able to completely overcome your self-agenda, your sense of self, and various kinds of conceptual categories and schemes and paradigms and worldviews and self-deceptions, and even your entire perceptual system, if you're able to overcome all of that, ultimately you will arrive at the absolute truth or at being. That is the thing which grounds everything. But this is so radical and so alien to what any ordinary human person has ever experienced that it's almost pointless to talk about it here because it is not nearly the same thing as data or facts, the way that scientists think about it. Data and facts are relative. Absolute being is absolute. But what that is, you're not conscious of it yet. You might think that I'm talking about some sort of other universe. That's not it. Absolute being, the irony of it and the difficulty of it is that it's right here, right now. Everything is absolute being, but it is not what you conventionally think of as data or facts or even perceptions. Even though it's not different from perception, it is still not the same thing as human perception. So you can only arrive at being through a state of samadhi or union between subject and object, which I've talked about in past episodes. So in a sense, the reason that scientists can agree to some data or facts is also because there is that absolute, and that absolute is not somewhere else. That absolute is right here, right now. It's just that they're not, and you're not fully conscious of what that is, and you're misinterpreting it with your projections and your worldview. You're kind of lumping it all together, and then you're calling that data and facts.